All right, so welcome to the workshop for open work permit for vulnerable workers. Right now, I am working as a settlement counselor in caregiver support. So I learned about this open work permit for vulnerable workers just this year. I never heard about it before. I've done a couple of applications and it requires a lot of work. But the benefits are that the workers are able to have an open work permit and leave abusive situations. I also find that using the word abuse or exploitation really can be intimidating to a lot of the workers because they don't want to cause trouble or they don't want to lose anything or lose their status. So it's wording it in a way that is not so overwhelming, and working with the people that we work with in a very respectful way. If there are any migrant workers here today, I'd love to hear your experiences as well, in terms of how we can help you do the open work permit for vulnerable workers. The application process is overwhelming, but we're here to help you get through the application process. So just an outline of what I'm going to be talking about today. I'm going to talk about what is abuse, because that might mean different things to different people. It might not mean the same thing that IRCC or Immigration, Refugees, Citizenship Canada might mean. So when you're also talking with migrant workers, it's also good to have a conversation about what that means. Provide examples that are specific, so it's not so vague. And then I'm going to go to the actual process of how to apply for an open work permit for vulnerable workers, what IRCC requires, the online application, as well as the actual permit application, which you can download from the website, the IRCC website. Okay, so just a conversation. So when you hear about abuse, what do you think about when what is abuse? Like if you were to talk with a migrant worker, or if there is a migrant worker here to talk about what abuse is, what would you say that it is? Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's I've had the same experience too, where I would speak with a worker, a care worker, and they would think abuse is, okay, I'm being beaten, I'm being raped, but when it comes to finances, they don't necessarily think about that. So when I actually read to them what financial abuse is, they're like, yeah, I'm actually experiencing that. And so yeah, I definitely experienced that. So that's why it's sometimes really good to give like examples of what it is. And on the website, it actually, for the IRCC website, it actually lists financial abuse and psychological abuse, which are harder to prove, but if there's text messages or emails, I would encourage a lot of you, if you're working with workers, especially migrant workers, if you are here, document everything, have a journal, text messages, keep your emails, because that would be evidence of what you could use as abuse, because they will look for evidence when you're trying to file this this open work permit. So this is in the my context when I work with care workers. It might apply to your context as well. So some examples of abuse could be an employer threatens you if you complain about your work conditions. So if you're working overtime and they're not paying you and you complain, your employer threatens you, that is a form of abuse. If your employer forces you to work outside of your work permit duties, so asking you to work for a different employer or performing duties that are outside of your work contract, those are actually forms of abuse that a lot of, at least in my experience, a lot of workers accept because they just want to get they just want their status, right? And they want to just not complain about it, and they don't want to cause trouble. That happens a lot in my case, like when I work with the care workers. Okay, so this is the video from IRCC. It is about a very general overview of the open work permit for vulnerable workers, and then I'll just go over it when we're done.
As a migrant worker in Canada with an employer-specific work permit, the job you do is important. You help our businesses grow. You should be able to do your job in a safe and healthy workplace and be treated with respect. But if you have been mistreated at work or are in an abusive job situation, you may be eligible for the Open Work Permit for Vulnerable Workers. It can help you leave your abusive situation and find a new job with a new employer. Don't worry, we will not contact your current employer during the application process, and there is no fee. To get started, you'll need to fill out the regular online work permit application. You will be asked for information about yourself before you are asked about the abuse. When you fill out your online application, you will be asked to attach a letter that tells us what you are experiencing and any other proof you feel is important. To find out about the types of evidence you should include, please go to canada.ca/vulnerable-foreign-workers. After we receive your application, we will treat it as a priority. If we have questions, you might be asked to do a private interview. If you're approved, you can find a new job, and any adult family members who came with you to Canada may also be eligible for an open work permit. You should know that if we approve your application, we'll investigate your former employer. Depending on what we find, they could get a fine or be stopped from hiring other migrant workers. If you are not approved, we won't tell your employer that you applied. As a migrant worker in Canada, your rights are protected. To find out more about the Open Work Permit, visit canada.ca/vulnerable-foreign-workers.
So they talked about a letter. So you can actually, when you're working with the migrant worker, you can talk with them, and then you can actually write the support letter to put in their application along with the evidence that you gather with them. So the types of abuse, there's, so this is, just to have a conversation with the migrant workers, and as well as for the migrant workers to talk about their experiences. So there's physical, there's sexual, psychological, and financial. So in terms of physical abuse, maybe ask the migrant worker, what is it? What's physical abuse to you? What does that mean? And that's, I think Carla said before, that's the most, common understanding of what physical abuse is, like being physically hurt by your employer. And that is, the most common understanding. So physical abuse is when your employer, hits, slaps, punches, burns, punches you, pushes you, chokes you, shoves you, forces you to use alcohol or drugs. That is actually physical abuse. Pressuring you to work in an unsafe and unsanitary work environment. So those are all examples of physical abuse. Some examples that you can use with migrant workers. So in my context, when I'm working with care workers, your employer shoves you because you didn't clean the floors properly. Your employer slaps your face when you ask them why you are working beyond your working hours unpaid. You live in your employer's home and they give you a dirty room with mold and rodents, and there are bugs in your bed. They refuse to give you a clean room. So those are some examples of physical abuse. So I'm going to turn it to the group. Yeah, with farm workers, right? Like that is definitely like a big issue, especially during the COVID time, right? Like that was a big, huge issue. Yeah, for sure, for sure. And it's also good to encourage them to have evidence, right? If they have emails or text messages, things like that, right? If they're being physically abused and they have a scar, if that, God forbid that ever happens, but like if they have a scar, take a picture. If go to the doctor and then they have like there's record, right? That they've been abused physically. And a medical doctor has the documentation, right? So you have that handy. I wasn't able to upload any evidence of like any moving files or anything like that, videos. But keep it in case the immigration officer does want more evidence. At least you can just keep it on hand. Yeah. All right. So sexual abuse. This could be a difficult, can be triggering, can be very traumatic for a lot of people. So this one, some workers won't even disclose it. But if they do, it's good to be aware of how you're communicating this with them as well, because a lot of working with people who experience this kind of trauma is it's difficult, and sometimes it's hard to prove, right? Like it's hard to prove this, but if it does happen and they're able to go to the hospital and then there's proof, but I mean that's not always easy to do. Okay, so when you're talking about sexual abuse with a migrant worker, it's important to to understand how they understand it as well, what sexual abuse means to them. Also explain that this is a force, a threat, or any manipulation for you to have sex with your employer or perform sexual acts without your consent. So that's the bottom line. If there's no consent, or using physical force, weapons, using these acts against your will, that is sexual abuse. Sometimes what happens if you're in a situation where you can't say no, so you're feeling traumatized, you're triggered, you can't talk, because that's what happens when people get triggered. They're unable to say no, right? That is still sexual abuse. If they can't verbally say no, because sometimes that does happen where they freeze and it's still not consensual. So that is sexual abuse. So if you're talking to a migrant worker and they said, well, I didn't say no, but kind of dig further and say, okay, did they make you feel like you couldn't say no? Were you feeling scared? Things like that, right? So that's not consent, right? Consent is when you're doing it willingly and you want to, but if you can't say a no, then you don't want to, right? So it's just explaining that it's about consent. And if they use these threats or manipulate you, that is sexual abuse. So some examples, if they, just so it's more concrete, you can let them know that if your employer touches you sexually or makes you touch them sexually. An example is when, so in the caregiver context, their spouse and children are not home, and then they tell you not to say anything or you'll lose your job. Your employer goes into your room and sexually assaults you there. So everyone's sleeping and then they sneak into your room. That is sexual abuse. You don't say anything because there's a need. You need the hours for your, so in the caregiver context, you need you need certain amount of hours to get your permanent residence. And you need your employer to write you a reference letter to bring your spouse and children to Canada. So you keep quiet, right? Because you don't want to cause trouble. You need these documents, right? For your status. It could be psychological, right? Like because if the worker talks to the employer, what happens there, right? So are they scared to bring it up to them to put boundaries with their employer? Do they feel threatened by that? That is a threat, right? A psychological threat, right? Like if is the worker intimidated to talk to the employer about setting boundaries, right? Because they're allowed to set boundaries, right? And if they're scared to do that and they're scared to lose their positions or their jobs, that could be psychological. Yeah, that is considered abuse. And I'll go over the COVID-19 as well, because a lot of employers are keeping their migrant workers at home, and that's actually against the law. They're not supposed to. And you can that's actually considered abuse. So any kind of control or intimidation is considered abuse. It's just again, it's the evidence is kind of hard to prove, but if you have a journal as much as you can, like encourage, if there's any migrant workers here, just if you can like document any kind of situation, yeah, and then the person you're working with, so if you have support, you can the person can write a support letter. So if they're working with Justicia, Justicia can write a support letter with the application. If it's an employer who is perpetrating the abuse, you can apply for the open work permit for vulnerable workers, and that would allow the migrant worker to leave the situation with status. So it's a protection for the worker, rather than just leaving without status and not knowing what's going to happen. The open work permit will allow you to leave your employer. Because my understanding is if you have a work specific permit, you're bound to that employer, right? Like you can't leave that employer and work for another employer. But with an open work permit, you can actually leave with with status, and that your status is protected. Okay, so psychological abuse. So we kind of touched on this a little bit earlier with our conversation. So psychological abuse is when, so this could be, multiple of experiences, right? But generally when we think about psychological abuse is when you're getting yelled at, insulted, intimidated, humiliating, like making you feel bad about yourself in a way that they're insulting you, harassing you, threatening to deport, right? That is huge psychological abuse, threatening to deport you back to your home country, calling you names, criticizing you, shaming you, disrespecting, controlling what you can or cannot do. So we just, if your employer's controlling you in the middle of the night, that's psychological abuse. Intimidating you with murder, threatening harm with an object and or a weapon. So if that is the case, emergency, call 911 if it comes to the point where they're intimidating you with murder. So if you have a spiritual or religious belief, they use that to manipulate you. And I'll go through examples of that in the next slide. So some examples are your employer yells at you. So again, in the caregiver context, your employer yells at you for not cooking their meals properly and puts you down to hurt your feelings. Your employer intimidates you into working extra hours by getting angry at you for no reason, but you don't want to cause conflict because you don't want to say anything, and you don't want to say anything because you want to be seen as a good employee. Even though your employers disrespect and criticize you, You rely on God to get through your day and pretend to be strong. Which is, I mean, relying on God, if that's your belief, I mean, that's fine. But if your employer is disrespecting and criticizing you, then that, and then using your religion against you, that is psychological abuse. How about in the farm work context? Any sort of psychological abuse, controlling, who people date, see in their intimate lives. Any more examples or experiences of psychological abuse? Yeah, it's like an intimidation, right? Because you're pitting employers against one another and making them scared, right? Because what's going to happen to you if you get replaced? You basically get sent back, right, to your original country. And any threat to deport is psychological abuse. Yeah, yeah. Oh, and also it's good to the number of occurrences. So if it happened like, I don't know, 5 times a week, it's good to actually document that many times, like that many times of when they're being abused. Like, it's good to be very specific too. So it's not just like a general, oh, I got sexually abused, but actually or I got psychologically abused. You have to be very specific and give examples, just to make it a more stronger document. If there are like language, with English, if it's difficult, like that's where the help is needed with the Justicia, right? Like you guys can like help with writing these support letters to IRCC. Oh, and other advocate organizations who are here on the conversation today. Okay, financial abuse. This is the one that I think Carlos brought up, and even me, that it is difficult for a lot of migrant workers to see financial abuse as abuse, because they just think that this is the way it is, right? This is the way it is. This is how other people are treated, and it's not going to change, right? So this is something that a conversation around would be helpful. So to help migrant workers and even us understand what financial abuse is, it's when employers don't pay the wages that they owe you. They steal money or withhold your credit card. They closely monitor how you spend your money. So again, that control issue as well. Spending your money without your consent. When you deposit money into your employer's bank account, so fraud. So it's your money, but you're depositing it into their account. Okay, so some examples, again, within the caregiving context. You're doing extra work that is unpaid, such as working 12 hours a day instead of 8 hours, which is stated on your contract. Your employer threatens you to pay back your LMIA, which is their responsibility. So if your employer is asking you to pay your LMIA out of your own pocket, that is grounds for financial abuse. That is, you're not responsible for, migrant workers are not responsible for LMIA. It is the employer's responsibility. So if you are working for your relatives and they are not paying you a salary, but give you allowance because you're family and you should be grateful that you're in Canada, that is actually financial abuse, which happens a lot in the caregiving context where they're working for their relatives and their relatives don't pay them a salary. That is abuse, financial abuse. If you speak up, if you tell your employer that you're being unpaid or underpaid during for doing work outside of your contract, that is financial abuse. You can file an application for open work permit for vulnerable workers as well. Yes, especially if it goes against their contract, right? Like if their contract says they need to work a specific amount of hours and they're entitled to have days off. the Employment Standards Act, right? Like you are entitled to have a day off, right? And if the employers threaten them, yeah, that could be considered abuse if they're working overtime and unpaid or underpaid. Yeah, probably more like digging into like their hours and having more detail around that, to have provide evidence that they are being abused financially. That would be great, right? Like to just have it down in more detail. Yeah, yeah. It's going to be tricky, but if you could like kind of encourage like a I know that's tough, right? Like a writing down in a journal, or and then so they can like document how many times, or if if there's a Spanish speaking person and they want to speak to you, you can help them document. Like you can be the one to like write down, right, over time what the issues are. Like, you know what I mean? Like if it's not within, yeah, yeah, if it's not within the norms, right? It can, but I honestly like I'm gonna go over like what kind of evidence they have. But yeah, I know from someone from the labor board said that as well, like to have a journal and documenting everything, and that could be some evidence. But yeah, I hear you. It's hard to um, say what the immigration officer will like. It's hard to say if they will consider that or not. You know what I mean? Like but as much as you can, try to document as much as possible on behalf of the person or the migrant worker. Yeah, it could count. Yeah, it could count. But I just don't know what an immigration officer will say, right? For yeah. I'll kind of go over the website on what would count as evidence, um, just to clarify um, some things. Yeah. Again, yeah, try as much as to help document, by paper as much as you can. So there's like these are different patterns that are happening over time, right? And how it makes the migrant worker feel, right, at the same time, right? Like does it help, does it make them feel intimidated to speak? Are they scared or intimidated, right? It's really hard to, again, to prove psychological abuse, right, especially if you're not communicating it by text or email, right, because not everyone has access to those things either, right? um, so yeah, it's if we can help encourage the writing of it, and as advocates we can help them to write the letter, that would be helpful. Yeah, but that's the tough part, the evidence part. For sure, that's a great idea. Documenting the dates and the times, if you can remember. Yeah, definitely. Thank you for sharing that. That's really good, for us to know. Especially if you've experienced that firsthand. Like that's good to know for us. To know how to support like other migrant workers as well. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. So especially now during COVID, a lot of abuse has been happening, right? Because you know, uh, employers feel some employers feel that they could, maybe control the situation more, but abuse does happen during this time. If you leave Canada for any reason and your employer doesn't give you the required wages owed during mandatory isolation period, or tries to get the wages back, um, that's actually that could be grounds also to do an open work permit application for vulnerable workers. You're forced by your employer to work when you're supposed to be in isolation. I have heard stories of care workers where they are forced to work when tested positive for COVID, and that that blows my mind, because I don't know why that is happening, but they are pressuring workers to work, even though they have been tested positive. Your employer pressures you to work when you have symptoms of COVID and you are not allowed to seek medical help. Okay, that's another one. You're not provided with proper protective equipment, or you're not being, or social, which is, I know in farm work, it's hard to maybe sometimes have the social or physical distancing. Or if you're fired for taking sick leave or refusing to work in unsafe conditions. So those are also grounds for, having, doing this open work permit for vulnerable workers. An example of abuse during COVID-19 is when your employer refuses to let you out of the house due to COVID, but they go out all the time and people come over their house. Again, you don't say anything because you're thinking about your PR application or your status, and you'd rather keep your status rather than your own health and well-being, right? So that's important to encourage migrant workers as well. Like, I know, some of the position, the status is precarious and you're worried about your status, but at the same time, your health and well-being is very important, and that is why it is important to get the support of Justicia or any other advocate organization to ensure that your health and well-being is a priority. Okay, any experiences or examples of any abusive situations during COVID? Right, because he's experiencing that awkwardness of, yeah, being in that situation, right? Right, yeah, so that would definitely count as, abuse during the time of COVID. So now I'm gonna go through the actual application. So once you've talked to the migrant worker, or you've spoke as a migrant worker, you've spoken to an advocate, about your experiences of abuse, what it means to you, and how they can help you write the support letter. Now here's the actual online application. Well, the website first. I'm gonna go through the website. Okay. So vulnerable foreign workers who are victims of abuse. Okay, if you need help right away, call 911. Okay, so you go through kind of like a conversation about what abuse is, and your mutual understandings of what that means to you and your migrant worker. Okay. So open work permits for vulnerable workers. So if you're being abused or risk of being abused in relation to your job in Canada, you may be eligible for open work permit for vulnerable workers. So it lets you work for any employer in Canada, except for one that is listed as ineligible. So there is a list of ineligible workers who have failed to comply with the conditions. So if you want to take a look at the list of employers, they are listed here. List of employers who failed to comply with conditions. And if you have an open work permit, you cannot work at can't work for an employer who offers striptease, erotic dance, escort services, or erotic massages. But other than that, you can, with an open work permit, you can work for any employer. So this, if you are granted open work permit for vulnerable workers, it helps to protect your rights as a worker in Canada by helping you leave an abusive situation to find a new job. However, it's a temporary solution, has an expiry date, and can't be renewed. If you're approved for this work permit, you should have enough time to find a new employer and apply for a new work permit. You must apply for another work permit before this one expires. Okay, so these are the little bits of information you need to know. You can apply if you are inside Canada. You have a valid employer-specific work permit. So this is a work permit that has your employer's name on it and is not expired. I unfortunately applied. I helped someone apply for a open work permit for vulnerable workers, and she had all the evidence of being abused, but her work permit was expired, so it was refused. So yeah, that was the unfortunate part. All the evidence was there, and she was rejected because her LMIA was expired and her work permit was expired. They can apply if they're inside Canada. Yeah, they're very specific with the requirements. I mean, this is, I guess this is the flaw of this application. They're very like, this has to be, how it is. It says inside Canada, so, and it says applications made at a port of entry won't be accepted. So if they're outside of Canada, I'm assuming no, but you'd probably have to call IRCC, right, to confirm. That's the thing. And the appeal process, you can do a labor claim. I think that's what another person did. They did a labor claim. But yeah, this is the difficult part of it. Like, they're very, and we even consulted with an immigration lawyer, and the immigration lawyer said, yeah, you have to have a valid employer work specific. So I guess this is now the gap we're seeing with this application. Yeah. The fees, there's no fee for this work permit, and you must apply online. So this is another barrier too, because a lot of people don't have computers. But if, that's where we can help. They have to have a scanner or camera, because the application only kind of accepts one document. So you gotta put everything together. The instruction guide is here, and they tell you how to fill out each field on the form. Okay, so now here's the evidence part. So support your application with evidence. To support your application, which includes as much evidence as you can with your application, you can upload documents as evidence in the client information. Okay, so there's only one client information field to upload all of your evidence. You have to combine all your evidence in one file and upload it together. Okay, so here, one document you must include as evidence is a letter to describe your situation. So you can have a support person do that with you, and the abuse you're facing or at risk of facing. Types of evidence can include a letter, statement or report from an abuse support organization, medical doctor, health professional, etc. So if you're an advocate or medical doctor or professional, this is, that counts as a type of evidence for the migrant worker. A sworn statement or like an affidavit, an official report, such as police or Canada Border Services, a copy of an official complaint. So if you filed a labor claim or you went to an immigration lawyer and they have documents, that counts as evidence. A victim impact statement, email messages, photos, and witness testimony. So these are types of evidence that count. So any kind of letter that an advocate organization works for you, or a medical doctor, that helps as evidence. So these list include examples of evidence. You may have other types. You may have other types of evidence. With the videos or moving files that couldn't upload anything, but again, keep those in hand. Then you create your online account where you can submit your documents. I'm just going to go to it now. So you sign into your secure IRCC account, and then you can either sign in with your GC key, or you can create an account, register, or you can sign in with a partner, and then they have a list of, so you can sign in with your bank account, things like that. Or you can create a GC key. Fortunately, English and French, I believe. Yeah, that's the, so that is another barrier for a lot of people. But yeah, it's mostly in English, and I believe you can do it in French as well. Okay, so when you get into the application, you log in. These are the steps you need to take. You start the application, choose apply to come to Canada, choose visitor visa, study and or work permit. For question 1, what do you like to do in Canada? Work. When asked what is your current country or territory of residence, choose Canada. Do you have a job offer, written job offer? Choose no. Absolutely, it's absolutely an abuse, yeah. Because you're disregarding the doctor's note, right? Oops. Yeah, you're disregarding the doctor. And if you're being forced, any type of force, and it goes against a right, then yes, that's you can, that is abuse, yeah. Oh, there we go. There's my page. Yeah, so if you, I'll actually send you, or I can give it to the hosts and send you the link so you can see what the link is and the questions that they ask. So in case you are wanting to apply for biometrics, migrant workers are not, they don't have to do, they don't have to do a biometric if they're in a vulnerable situation. So you don't have to worry about that. Yeah, so all the information's there. I'm gonna quickly go over the form and then wrap up. So this is the form that the migrant worker would help, sorry, the migrant worker would fill out, or as advocates, we can help them fill out. Just need their UCI number, service in English or French. Those are the only 2 languages on there. I'm applying for one or more of the following. It would be apply for a work permit for the first time with a new employer because you're applying for a different work permit. Then you just put their name, shown on their passport, given names, if they had any other names, their sex, date of birth, place of birth, their citizenship, their country of residence is in Canada, their status is a worker, and then you just put the periods of their work permit there. If they've worked in any other countries, yes or no, the current marital status, or common law relationship. If they've been in previous relationships, common law or married relationships, their language. So for example, you put, so they have a bunch of languages here that you put in. So I'm gonna put, for example, Moldovan. Are you able to speak in English or French? They have English, French, both or neither. So if you have neither, and then they ask if you take an English test, say no or yes. Your passport number, national identity document. Are you a PR resident in the US? Your contact information, and coming to Canada, information there, details of intended work. So here for details of intended work, what type of work permit are you applying for? You put here open work permit for vulnerable workers. So right there. Details of prospective employer. You don't have to have a job offer. You can just put NA if they don't have a new employer. And and then their education and employment history, background information, okay. And then they sign, and then date, and then they have to validate the form. So when you click validate, it'll have like barcodes, and then you have to have the barcodes to upload onto the online application. And I believe with the online application, they can just type in their name to sign the document. Okay, so that is that. Yeah, so usually they do get approved for these cases, but a lot of employers do seem to talk to them via text and email. Like they don't really talk with them. So I find that sometimes like they just even send me the text messages, and it's easier to prove that way. Like the employers are really kind of hands off with a lot of them. Like they don't really talk to them. And they just say, oh, do this, do that. Oh, do this, do that, right? So it's kind of easier, right? And but in the farm work situation, I get that it might be a little bit more difficult. I mean, if they are not approved for, you know, worst comes to worst, they're not approved for an open work permit, they can always claim a labor claim, do a labor claim. Yeah, because that's what happened to one of my clients. She did a labor claim and because her LMIA expired, and sorry, her work permit expired, and that was the only reason for being rejected, which is quite sad. So it is important to yeah, she was able to do a labor claim. They are supposed to have a valid permit. Yeah. Yeah, unfortunately, no. And this work permit is fairly new, right? Like it only really happened because of advocates who really pushed for it, right? But there's still all these like rules and stipulations, and you know, so it's better, but then at the same time we still, you know, it's still work in progress. Still needs to change a little bit more, a lot more actually. Yeah. It's very long, and maybe because I'm also trying to be thorough as well. So I want to make sure that like all the evidence is there, and everything makes sense. Because I almost feel like I'm a lawyer, just having my, you know, this is the evidence, and it's almost heartless, almost like when you're like talking to the IRCC officer, because you're like, this is the evidence and this is what it is, and you know. Yeah. So I would say the actual process of doing it is unfortunately around 5 hours. It takes time, but the turnaround is really quick, because IRCC actually prioritizes it over all other applications. You will hear back between 5 to 10 business days. So in terms of hearing back from IRCC, it will be fast because they put everything aside for open work permit for vulnerable workers. Yeah. And if they get granted open work permit, like they can have some time to look for another position as well. Yeah. So I guess that's the upside of this. Like it is a fast turnaround, so they're not waiting and waiting. I know everything has slowed down with IRCC at this point with applications. Everything is so slow, but they have been still really quick with the open work permit for vulnerable workers. It's just the process of doing it is longer, but if you are more thorough and more careful with putting everything together, you're probably and they have a valid LMIA, valid work permit, then yeah, you're most likely gonna get a quick response. Yes, but from what I heard, they haven't been doing that because of COVID, but I don't know how it's like with Oh, yeah, yeah, because you're kind of you're documenting like a like kind of like over time what happened. So there's like even if it happened once, like you're still eligible to apply. But if it happened a while back,
No,
you're still with
I'm
your
on a break
employer,
right
you're
now.
still in the
My work is
situation,
11 week. I
you
cannot.
can still apply. Yeah, yeah. Okay, so if you get the open work permit for vulnerable workers, you can work for, so it says on the website, um, so an open work permit lets you work for any employer in Canada, except for ineligible, yeah. So for the open work permit for vulnerable workers, you can work for any employer, but the open work permit for vulnerable workers, the application cannot be renewed and it has an expiry date. Yeah. Okay, so for the LMIA, you can renew that, right? You can renew a new, you can renew an employer-specific work permit. But for the open work permit for vulnerable workers, no, it says here you can't renew that one because you're out of the abusive situation, right? Because this one's only really for abusive situations. The open
Yeah.
work permit for you can't renew that one. So if you're out of the situation, that's the main purpose to get out of it. But if you want to renew your specific employer specific work permit, yeah, you can change employers and then they can apply for a new LMIA and you can always renew that one. Yeah. Yes, so after the year, yeah, that would be applying for the new permit. Yeah, the LMI after that 1 year, right? Yeah, make sure you don't get obsessed, right? Like, so if the after 1 year, the open work permit for vulnerable workers, you're not able to, you can't renew it. Yeah, then you need to find another employer, and then, or if your employer wants to hire you and give you a LMIA, yeah, after that 1 year, then yes. Not that I heard of. Um, no, not that I heard of, but not that they've disclosed to me, but it could potentially happen, right? Yeah. Has anyone experienced like the stigma of that? Like if I know, well, not with the open work permit, but like stigma within like communities of workers. Has anyone experienced that or heard of that? Um, Yeah, it might be a little bit different in like my contacts with care workers because they're employed in the home and like individual families. So I don't know if employers connect like to the extent that farm worker connections do. I'm not sure. But from what I know, like employers don't know another care worker's employer. You know what I mean? Like it might be a different context as
Right.
well. Right. Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, because my like the context I'm in is quite different, right? Yeah, yeah, that's something that is to keep in mind as well. Yeah. Sorry, I don't have an answer for that. For sure. Yeah, definitely. That's definitely a barrier here for sure. Um, yeah, yeah, for sure. Yeah, I'm not sure why they have that rule here. Why have an expiry date can't be renewed. Maybe it's something to bring up to bring up to IRCC as well, right? Yes, they closed the applications from now to January. Yeah, so they're not accepting, they're returning the applications back. But they're starting again in January, but they're keeping a quota, right? So yeah, yeah. It's going to be a little difficult for people to apply. Yeah. And more higher requirements too, right? With education and English requirements. So it's a little tougher. Yeah. 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 They generally accept it. And the success rate has been fairly good.